Modern Indian History, 1857 to 1947, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Unit 28, Growth of Trade Union and Peasant Movement, 1920s to 1930s. Structure 28.0, Objectives, 28.1, Introduction, 28.2, Condition of the Workers, 28.3, Rise of Trade Unionism, 28.3.1, Meaning of Trade Unionism, 28.3.2, Early History, 28.3.3, Formation of All India Trade Union Congress, 28.4, Growth of Trade Unions, 28.5, Split in the AITUC, 28.6, New Phase, 28.7, Hardships of the Peasantry, 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 28.8, Peasant Movements during 1920s, 28.9, Peasant Movements during 1930s, 28.10, Formation of All India Kisan Sabha, 28.11, The Congress and the Peasantry, 28.12, Let us sum up, 28.13, Key Words, 28.14, Answers to Check Your Progress Exercises. 28.0, Objectives. The purpose of this unit is to give you a short history of the growth of, quote, trade union and peasant movements, unquote, in India during the 1920s and 1930s. After going through this unit, you will be able to, point 1, know about the condition of the workers. Point 2, understand the meaning to trade unionism, its early history, and the formation of the All India Trade Union Congress. Point 3, follow the process of development of trade union movement and the split which took place at the later stage. Point 4, know about the hardships faced by the peasantry. And point 5, explain how peasant movements emerged in various parts of the country and how the peasants were organized in Kisan Sabhas. 28.1, Introduction. In Unit 7 of Block 2, you have read about the peasants and the working class movements in the second half of the 19th century. In this unit, we will explain to you the growth of trade union and peasant movements during the 1920s and 1930s. We will first take up the trade union movement and after that the peasant movement. You have already seen how the exploitation and oppression by the colonial government, landlords, and mill owners led to popular uprisings of the peasantry and the workers during the second half of the 19th century. During the first half of the 20th century, you will see how these movements gradually got an organizational character and pressurized the colonial regime to change its policy. Some important points you should bear in mind for this change in the character of the working class and peasant movements of this period. Point 1. the emergence of new trends in the national movement, particularly the shift to mass politics and mass mobilization. Point 2. The economic and social consequences of the First World War, which adversely affected different sections of the Indian people. And point 3. The impact of Bolshevik Russia, Bolshevik, Bolshevik Russia, and the growth of socialist ideas in India. These factors gave rise to the working class and peasant movements in India, which were radically different from what we witnessed in the earlier periods. Section 28.2. Condition of the workers. We will now briefly describe the conditions of the workers, which largely explain why trade unions grew in India. Bombay, the main center of India's cotton textile industry, and Bengal, the center of jute and tea industry, had the maximum working class population in India. The living and working conditions of the workers were very miserable. They worked for 15 and even 18 hours a day. There were no leave rules, no security of jobs. The workers had to bribe jobbers, Jobbers, or sirdars, Sirdars, on whom depended their fate. They lived in dark, damp butties or slums with no water supply and no sanitary arrangements. The condition of the coal mine workers was even more miserable. In the coal mines in Jharia and Giridih, Jharia, Jharia, Giridih, Giridih, the working hours were from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Women and children worked underground, and accidents were very common. But it was not until 1923 that accident insurance of a sort was introduced by the government. Even so, workers found it difficult to establish their claims for compensation. The workers were paid low wages so that the employers could maximize profits. The Royal Commission of Labour pointed out that wages were lower in Madras and Kanpur and highest in Bombay. Over the years, fines were imposed on the workers for breakages, late attendance, and underproduction. Indebtedness spread among the workers, who often turned to Kabuli money lenders. Kabuli, Kabuli. These money lenders charged high rates of interest. There was no provision for provident fund or pension. When the workers grew old, they lost their jobs and had to rely for their sustenance on their children or relatives. Check your progress 1. Use the space given below for your answers. 1. Write about 5 lines on the problems of the workers. 2. Write yes or no against each sentence. A. Bombay was the main center of India's jute industry. B. Calcutta and Bombay had the maximum working class population. C. The workers had to work for 15 to 16 hours a day. D. The Royal Commission on Labour was appointed to inquire the condition of the workers. E. The workers had the right to strike. F. The workers had the right to old age pension. Modern Indian History, 1857 to 1947. Indira Gandhi National Open University. Section 28.3, Rise of Trade Unionism. You will now see how workers organized themselves into trade unions to fight against their exploitation. The rise of trade unionism marked a new epoch, 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 in working class movement. 28.3.1 Meaning of trade unionism. Trade unionisms, which are very common today, are associations of the workers formed with the purpose of improving their conditions under which they work in mills and factories. With the formation of mills and factories in India in the 19th century, hundreds of workers began to work together and meet every day. This gave them the opportunity to discuss their problems and place their views before the employers. The workers were mostly illiterate. They did not have any idea in the beginning of forming trade unions and uniting themselves. There were a few outsiders, mostly intellectuals, who tried for years to educate and organize them in trade unions. Very often, they became leaders of the unions. Section 28.3.2 Early History. As we have already said, a few individuals, being moved by the miserable condition of the workers, tried to improve their working conditions. For example, in Bengal, Sasipada Banerjee, Sasipada, Banerjee, Banerjee, a radical Brahmao, Brahmao, founded the Working Men's Club. He also published a journal, the Bharat Shramjীবী, or Indian Worker. Bharat, Bharat, Shramjীবী, Sramjibi, in 1874, and organized night schools to spread education among the jute mill workers. But he did not form a trade union. Similarly, in Bombay, N.M. Lokhande, Lokhande, started the weekly Dinabandhu, Dinabandhu, in 1880 and founded the Bombay Mill Hands Association in 1890. This association, though not a trade union, put forward the demands of point 1, reduction in working hours, point 2, a weekly holiday, and point 3, compensation for injuries suffered by the workers during work at the factories. B.P. Wadia, a close associate of Annie Besant, formed the Madras Labour Union in April 1918. This was the first trade union in India. In Ahmedabad, a center of cotton textile industry, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi led a strike of the workers in 1918. Referring to the conditions of the worker, Gandhi wrote in his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, that, quote, Wages were low, and the laborers had long been agitating for an increment. Unquote. Gandhi requested the mill owners to refer the matter to arbitration, but they refused. Gandhi then advised the laborers to go on a strike. The strike continued for 21 days. Gandhi began a fast, but after 3 days a settlement was reached. In 1920, Gandhi formed the Majur Mahajan, M-A-J-U-R, Majur, M-A-H-A-J-A-N, Mahajan, which advocated peaceful relations between the workers and their employers, arbitration and social service. Section 28.3.3 Formation of All India Trade Union Congress. Trade unionism was slowly gaining ground through the efforts mentioned above. In 1919 to 1920, there was a wave of strikes in many industrial centers such as Kanpur, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, Jamshedpur, and Ahmedabad. Thousands of workers took part in these strikes. It was in this background that the All India Trade Union Congress, AITUC, was formed in Bombay in 1920. Lala Lajpat Rai presided over the inaugural session, which was attended by prominent national leaders and trade unionists like Motilal Nehru, Annie Besant, C.F. Andrews, B.P. Wadia, and N.M. Joshi. The All India Trade Union Congress was the central organization of the Indian workers. Although strikes became frequent in the 1920s, growth of trade unionism among the workers was rather slow. The Royal Commission on Labour gives 2 reasons for it. 1. Differences of language and community were factors that stood in the way of workers' unity. In the Bengal jute mills, for instance, the majority of the workers came from Bihar and UP, and Bengali workers were in a minority. 2. The jobbers, Jobbers, and the employers were opposed to the growth of trade unions. In 1929, only 51 unions with 190,436, that's 190,436 members were affiliated to AITUC. But the majority of the workers were not yet organized in trade unions. The fear of dismissal from jobs also kept the workers away from the trade unions. Check your progress too. Use the space given below for your answers. 1. What is a trade union? Answer in 25 words. 2. Is trade union useful for the workers? Answer in 25 words. 3. Write 5 sentences on the early initiatives for the improvement of the conditions of the workers. 4. How was the All India Trade Union Congress formed? Answer in 50 words.
The modern India. 1857 to 1964 by Indira Gandhi Open Universities. We are going to unit 28.4. The topic is growth of trade unions. In spite of these hurdles, the trade union movement was gaining popularity among the workers. The main reason for this was that the workers had many grievances, such as long hours of work, bad housing, new wages, dismissals from jobs, etc. They turned to the outsiders for help. The outsiders were nationalists, communists, and socialists. Sometimes they were also independents in the sense that they did not belong to any party. These outsiders organized meetings of the workers, wrote petitions addressed to the employers, and formulated charter on demands. Para 2. They organized them into trade unions, which in many cases were affiliated to the All India Trade Union Congress. When the employers refused to consider their demands, the workers struck work. During the strike, the trade unions often helped them with money because they did not receive wages during the strike. Strikes meant a great deal of suffering for the workers. When strike continued for months. Especially when strikes continued for months. Even so, numerous strikes occurred in factories. Middle-class employees who worked in government offices and commercial firms also formed trade unions and organized strikes. Now, we will tell you about some strikes in India during this period. Bombay was the largest center of cotton mills in India. Most of these mills were built by Indian capitalists. In 1924, there was a big strike of 150,000 workers in Bombay against the refusal of bonus which had been done during the preceding 4 years. In 1926, the Textile Labor Union was formed with N.M. Joshi as the president. In April 1928, there was a general strike in Bombay. The workers in most of the mills joined the strike. On 9 October, the strike was withdrawn when the government appointed a committee to consider the demands of the workers. Thus, the strike forced the government to intervene in the dispute between workers and the employers. Para 3. In Bengal, the British capitalists owned the jute mills. It was the biggest industry in Bengal. There occurred 592 industrial disputes in Bengal during 1921 and 29. Out of these, 236 occurred in jute mills. In 1928, the workers of Fort Gloucester Mills in Bauria in Howrah district struck work. This strike was remarkable in the sense that it continued from 17th July to 31st December for about 6 months. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote on this strike. His lines were, "The village of Bauria lies 16 kilometers from Howrah town. In this village and the surrounding area is being fought a grim struggle between the poor workers in the factory and jute kings of Bengal. 15,000 of them have carried on struggle for 6 months or more." In July 1929, there was a general strike in the jute mills. The Bengal Congress showed sympathy for the strike. The government intervened and the strike ended on 16th August. We'll move to the next para 4. Jamshedji Tata founded the first modern steel factory in India in Jamshedpur, which was named after him. About 20,000 workers worked in this factory, and 1920 the workers formed the Labour Association. In a protest against to the dismissal of large number of workers, the Tata Steel factory started a general strike in 1928, which continued for more than 6 months. Though the strike was not wholly successful, the Labour Association was recognized by the employers. Para 5. During the same period in Ahmedabad, a 20% wage cut by the mill's owners led to a general strike in 56 out of 64 textile mills. Madras city was also an important center of trade union movement. The first May Day was celebrated in 1923 at Madras by Singaravelu. End. Next topic, 28.5 unit. Heading, split in the AITUC. Para 1. The Great Economic Depression started in America and spread throughout the world in 1929. The depression in India continued till 1936. Hundreds of factories closed down and thousands of workers lost their jobs. The number of unions also fell. Para 2. Unfortunately, there were 2 splits within the All India Trade Union Congress during this period. The first split took place in 1929. Jawaharlal Nehru was then the president of the AITUC. The main issue was whether the AITUC would boycott the Royal Commission on Labour appointed by the British government or not. The moderates wanted to join it while the extremists wanted to boycott it. Finally, the moderates left the AITUC and formed the Indian Trade Union Federation with V.V. Giri as the president. There was another split in 1931. The communists left the AITUC and formed the Red Trade Union Congress. The splits took place when thousands of workers were being dismissed by the employers. The splits weakened the trade union movement. The end. (28.6) unit. Title, New Phase. However, a new phase of trade union movement started from 1935 onwards. The unity in the AITUC was restored. The Indian economy began to improve from 1936 onwards. In 1937, the Congress formed ministries in the provinces. The formation of the Congress ministries aroused inspiration and expectation among the workers. The number of trade unions doubled between 1936 and 1939, and the number of members also increased considerably. The number of strikes increased from 157 in 1936 to 406 in 1939. Notable strikes included those affecting the Kesaram cotton mills in Calcutta and Ahmedabad textiles in 1935. The Bengal Nagpur Railway in December 1936 to February 1937, and a series of labor disputes in Calcutta jute mills, the Kanpur textile mills during 1936, culminating in the next year in massive general strikes in both centers. An important development of this period was the attempt made by the leftists and socialists to unite the trade unions and peasant organizations for a collective movement. Indeed, it was a phase of the expansion of the trade union movement. The end. Now let's check your progress. Progress 3. First question, why did trade union movement become popular among the workers? How did the outsiders help the workers? Answer in about 10 lines. Question 2. What was the effect of the Great Depression on the workers? Answer in about 3 lines. Question 3. Discuss in brief the growth of trade union movement after 1937. Answer in about 100 words. The end. Unit 28.7, Hardships of the Peasantry. A number of peasant struggles were witnessed in various parts of India during the 1920s and 1930s. In Unit 7 of Block 2, you have already read about the establishment of colonial rule adversely affected the Indian peasantry and how they rose in arms on their own against their exploitation. In this unit, we will see how the change in time did not bring an end to the exploitation of the peasantry. Rather, it continued unabated. Para 2. But peasants had learnt from their experience that they should not remain unorganized to fight against the dash of government and the landlords. The 20th century on one hand showed only the revolt of not only the revolt of peasantry against the excesses of the talukdari and zamindari system, but also the formation of peasant organizations like the Kisan Sabhas. Para 3. There may be certain variations in the form of exploitation in different parts of India, but in general, the peasants in India suffered great hardships and were always at the mercy of others. Here, we will list some of the major grievances of the peasantry, which will help you understand the real condition of the peasantry of that time. Point 1. In many regions, the peasants had no occupancy rights on the lands tilled by them. The landlords had the power to evict them, which they used to harass their tenants. Point 2. Besides the regular taxes payable to the landlords compel the tenants to pay nazaranas, cannot find out what this word is, and other gifts on various pretexts. Point 3. The heavy burden of land revenue or rent made the peasantry heavily indebted to village merchants and landlords who charged heavy interest rates. It was very difficult for the peasants to get rid of the debt trap, which continued from generation to generation. Point 4. The outbreak of the First World War added to the miseries of the peasants. For example, in many regions, they had to pay for war funds, military service, etc. Point 5. During this period, there was a sharp rise in the prices of food grains. This rise in prices benefited the middlemen and the merchants, not the poor. In such a situation, it was the duty of the government to help the peasant. But the government itself was on the side of the landlords. This was because it depended on the landlords for stability of its rule in the countryside. That is why, under the pressure of these hardships, the peasants chose the path of revolt as the way of their emancipation. Now let end. Now let's check your progress. 4. Question 1. What were the main grievances of the peasants? Answer in about 100 words. Question number 2. Which of the following statements are correct or wrong? Mark, a tick, or a cross. There are 5 points. First question. During the period, the peasants for the first time organized themselves into Kisan Sabhas. Number 2. The landlords had no right to evict the tenants from the lands tilled by them. 3. The peasants were forced, but they willingly paid the abwabe to the landlords. 4. The rise in prices of food grains was beneficial for the poor peasants. 5. The government was very much sympathetic to the grievances of the peasantry. The end. I'd left out a point in between. The second point in the third paragraph, besides the regular, I will repeat it, besides the regular taxes payable to the landlords compel the tenants to pay nazarnas or abwabs and other gifts on various pretexts. The end. Let's move on to part 2 in another session. Thank you. Modern India, 1857-1964. Part 2. 28.8 unit. Topic: Peasant movements during 1920s. Paragraph 1. Against this background, we will now discuss some of the important peasant movements that took place during the 1920s. UP was one of the strong centers of the peasant movements during this period. The oppressive talukdari and zamindari system made the peasants' life unbearable. The nationalists showed a great deal of interest in the problems faced by the peasants, but it was Baba Ram Chandra who took the initiative to organize the peasants of Oudh against the landlords. Baba Ram Chandra was a Maharashtrian Brahmin by birth. He went to Fiji as an indentured laborer in 1905, and from there he came to the Oudh countryside in 1917 to 1918. Dressed like a sannyasi monk, he moved amongst the peasants, held meetings in the villages, and quoted the Ramacharitmanas for awakening the mobilizing peasants in the countryside. He told the peasants that they were in bondage to the government and talukdars, and only by unifying themselves into an organized group could they end this bondage. When he was arrested by the British government in August 1920, numerous peasants flocked to the court compound demanding his release. Para 2. The peasant movement got associated with the Congress-launched non-cooperation movement in 1920. In 1921, peasant movements became militant and spread to Raebareli, Faizabad, and Sultanpur in central UP. The peasants held demonstrations demanding that evictions from land should stop. They raided the houses of the landlords and the money lenders. On 6 January 1921, the peasants gathered at Futsat Bazaar to protest against the high cost of grains and cloth, the heavy profit making of the banias, and high-handedness of talukdars. The police failed to disperse the peasants and fired on them. 6 persons were killed. The defenseless peasants were again fired upon on January when thousands of peasants collected at the Munshiganj bridge at Raebareli. Nehru described this incident in his autobiography. As I reached the river, sounds of firing could be heard from the other side. I was stopped at the bridge. We found that men had been killed in the firing. Para 3. The situation, however, changed the summer of 1921. The movement faded out due to the repressive policy of the government. The efforts of the congressmen to restrain the movement and the amendment of the Audrent Act in 1921. But this failed to pacify the peasants, and in late 1921 and in early 1922, the movement emerged again in Hardoi, Barbanki, Sitapur district, etc. In these districts, the Ekha movement was started by the peasants. Madari, a radical peasant leader, was the leading spirit behind this. The movement led him posed a serious challenge to the landlords and the administration. However, the movement failed due to the repressive policy of the British government. But Madari Pasi could not be arrested. Madari Pasi, Madari Pasi. In North Bihar, the peasant movement grew under the leadership of Swami Vidyanand. The Raja of Darbhanga, who had estates in this area, oppressed the local peasants in various ways. Swami Vidyananda organized the peasants against the Darbhanga Raj. But here the movement was not militant as in UP. Para 5. In Bengal, all the peasants joined the no-tax movement. This was more intense in the Midnapur district. The peasants refused to pay the union board taxes. The movement became so strong that the members of the union boards resigned. The government decided not to proceed with the union boards. Thus, the movement ended in victory. Para 6. The Congress attempted to mobilize the peasants in Gujarat. In 1927, the government had enhanced the revenue in Bareilly in spite of the fall in the prices of cotton. Leaders like Vallabhai Patel and Kunvanji Mehta played an important role in mobilizing the peasants. This led to the beginning of the Bardoli Satyagraha, Bardoli, Bardoli Satyagraha in 1928. The peasants refused to pay revenue to the government. As a result, there was much repression and the lands of the peasants were seized by the government. At least the government arrived at a compromise and the state of assessment of revenue was reduced. Beside the movements mentioned above, there were sporadic peasant revolts in other parts of the country as well. In Rajasthan, Malabar, Orissa, Assam and other provinces also the peasants vehemently protested against the injustice done to them. 28.9 units. Peasant movements in the 1930s. During the 1930s, also the peasants rose to revolt in different provinces. The peasant struggle was most intense in the UP. Here the Congress gave a call for no tax movement and asked zamindars to stop paying revenue. But some leaders wanted to start a non-rent movement. What is a non-rent movement? It is a movement of the tenants who paid rent to the landlords. While no tax movement was directed against the government, the no rent movement affected the landlords. In the winter of 1931, a no rent movement was launched. There was a great response from the tenants. They stopped paying rents to the landlord. The movement spread in Raebareli, Etawah, Kanpur, Unnao, and Allahabad. And leaders like Kalka Prasad of Raebareli asked the peasants to stop all kinds of payments. The government tried to suppress the movement. The peasant union was declared illegal. The movement was crushed. Para 2. In Bengal and Bihar, the peasants took part in no tax movements. In Bengal, even peasant women prepared and contraband salt in Midnapur district and were beaten up by the police. In Magnum and Singhbum and Dinajpur districts, the tribal peasants joined the salt satyagraha and went to jail, but there was no movement for the non-payment of rent to the landlords. Para 3. In Madras, the peasant movement had begun to grow already. The Andhra Rights Association was formed in 1928, whose leader and professor was N.G. Ranga. The Riots Association popularized an immediate demands of the peasantry, and reduction of rents was one of the most important demands which affected the landlords. When the civil disobedience movement began, the riots held meetings in the villages and campaigned against land revenue. The agitation became strong in Tanjavur, Madura and Salem. By late 1931, grain riots started in some districts. In Krishna district, the house of a moneylender was raided and his granary was robbed. In Guntur district, there was a clash between the police and the peasants. But in spite of the efforts of the government and the Congress to restrain the peasant movement, it continued to grow with much vigor. The end of part 2. Thank you. Modern India, 1857 to 1964. Unit 28.10, Formation of All India Kisan Sabha. We are into recording part 3 from me. In different regions, provincial Kisan Sabhas were already formed by the 1920s. But the need for a central organization of the peasants was felt by the socialists and the communists. Their efforts led to the formation of the All India Kisan Sabha in 1936. By 1937, branches of the All India Kisan Sabha were formed in different provinces. N. G. Ranga, Swami Sahajanand, Narendra Dev, Indulal Yagnik, and Bankim Mukherjee were some of the prominent leaders of the All India Kisan Sabha. The objectives of the Kisan Sabha were: 1. Protection of the peasants from economic exploitation. 2. The abolition of landlordism such as zamindari and talukdari systems. 3. Reduction of revenue and rent. 4. Moratorium on debts. 5. Licensing of money lenders. 6. Minimum wages for agricultural laborers. 7. Fair price for commercial crops. And 8. Irrigation facilities, etc. In their meetings and demonstrations, the Kisan Sabha popularized these demands and put pressure on the government to concede to these demands. In its second annual meeting at Faizpur, the AIKS urged all anti-imperialist forces in the country, and especially the Kisans and workers, develop their day-to-day struggles against their exploiters. As represented by the British government in India, the zamindars and landlords and industrialists and moneylenders, the AIKS decided to work independently of the Congress and proclaimed that the emancipation of the peasants lay in their own organization. The Kisan Sabha launched a new type of movement which was directed mainly against the landlords. In Bihar, there was a popular movement in 1937-38 which was known as Bakasht movement. Bakasht. Bakasht. Bakasht means self-cultivated. The landlords often evicted the tenants from Bakasht land. With this information of the Congress ministry in 1937, the Kisan Sabha thought that the time had come to force the issue of the Bakasht. It launched the Bakasht movement, during which the peasants fought against eviction. There were clashes between the landlords and the peasants. In Bengal, also the Kisan Sabha was active. In the Burdwan district, the canal tax was imposed on the peasants after the construction of the Damodar Canal. The Kisan Sabha organized a Satyagraha movement for the reduction of canal tax. The government partly accepted the demand of the Kisan Sabha and the movement was withdrawn. In North Bengal district, the Hattola movement was launched. Hatpola, Hattola. Landlords collected a levy from the peasants who sold rice, paddy, vegetables, cattle in fairs and hats, weekly markets. The peasants refused to pay this levy. Sometimes landlords came to compromise with the peasants and exempted poor peasants from paying the levy. In 1939, there was a movement of these sharecroppers. They were poor peasants who tilled the land of the landlord and gave a portion of the produce to the landlord. But they had no security of tenure and could be evicted by the landlord. In 1939, the tenants took the crop from the field of their threshing floor. Previously, they had to carry the crop on the landlord's granary when the crop was threshed and then divided between the sharecropper and the landlord, the movement became strong in Dinajpur district in North Bengal. The movement came to compromise with the peasants. It was decided that in future paddy would be stored in a place to be decided by the landlord and the sharecropper. Thus, the movement was successful and the peasants learnt the power of organization. Similarly, there were peasant struggles in Orissa, Andhra Pradesh during this period. N.G. Ranga played a vital role in organizing the peasants in Andhra Pradesh. 28.11 Unit. Title: The Congress and the Peasantry. The question that now come to our mind are: what was the Congress response to the peasants' movement? What was the peasants' response to the Congress-led nationalist movement? The Congress leadership was well aware of the strength of the peasantry and their importance in struggle against the British Raj. They were also concerned about the peasant issues and the grievances of the peasantry. This is reflected in Nehru's observation made in 1937. The outstanding problem of India is the peasant problem. All else is secondary. But the right wing with the Congress, which represented the dominant social groups in the Indian society, were afraid of the growing class consciousness of the Indian peasants and of the demand of the Kisan Sabha for the abolition of landlordism. They wanted the peasants' support to strengthen the anti-imperialist movement but avoided the peasants' demand against the landlords. Whenever the peasants rose against the landlords, the Congress leadership tried to restrain them. The right-wingers regarded the formation of the Kisan Sabha as a challenge to the Congress organization. Mahadev Desai advocated, if a Kisan Sabha sets up integral feud between Kisan and Zamindars, it harms the Congress cause. The Congress knows best how to deal with the different elements composing the nature. It is for Congress to lay down the policies, not for individuals or for groups to dictate them by a threat or show of force, it concluded. Against this, if we look at the Kisan Sabha and the peasant movements, we find that at no stage the Kisan workers worked against the Congress. They had full faith on the Congress and its role for the liberation of the country. But unlike the Congress, right-wingers and Kisan leadership demanded emancipation not only from British rule, but also from the hegemony of the zamindars and capitalists. This was the basic issue which led to differences between the Congress leadership and the peasant leadership. The attitude of the peasants to the Congress became clear from the speech of Sahajanand given on 4th October 1939. We all cling to the Congress not for its magic or mystery, but because it represents the nation. It has not taken any false step at critical junctures. All our attempts are simply to strengthen its hands in taking opportune decisions at this most critical juncture of our national struggle for deliverance. Now let's check your progress. Question progress 5. Question number 1. How was the peasant movement started in UP during the 1920s? Answer in about 100 words. What were the major demands of the AIKS? Answer in about 5 lines. Question number 3. Give your answers in one sentence. What is no revenue movement? Second, who was the leader of Bardoli Satyagraha of 1928? Number 3. Who was Bakasht land? What is Bakasht land? Number 4. Who were the sharecroppers? Unit 28.12. Let us sum up. The hardship and miseries of the workers created a favorable ground for the growth of trade union movement in India. But the illiteracy of the co-workers, their differences of language, race, and community, and above all these anti-trade union attitude of the employers delayed the formalities of the formation of trade union in India. Even so, trade union movement gradually became very strong from 1920s onwards. The outsiders helped the growth of trade unions. The formation of All India Trade Union Congress in 1920 was a landmark. It should be remembered that congressmen, communists, socialists, and independents worked together in the AITUC. There was an expansion from trade unionism from 1937 onwards. The Congress formed ministries in the provinces. This aroused popular expectation and they joined trade unions and launched strikes. The communists and socialists played an active role in these strikes. The excessive burden of taxation, fear of eviction, no occupancy right on land, and the rise in prices of essential commodities on one hand, and the passive attitude of the government to this injustice forced the peasantry to rise in revolt. Different states of India witnessed a series of peasant uprisings during 1920s and 1930s. The peasants organized themselves in Kisan Sabhas and a new type of movement started. The movement were directed mainly against the landlords. All India Kisan Sabha was formed as a central organization of the peasants. This was one of the lasting effects of the peasant movements during this period. Unit 28.13 Keywords. Cess, CESS, means Levi, Levy. Hat Tola, Hattola, means levy on traders in the village market, which was also called Hat, Hat. Jobber, Jobber, is a middleman who used to procure labor for factories. Mahajan, the person who lends money. May Day is the 1st May is observed throughout the world as Workers' Day in memory of those workers who lost their lives in police firing in America in 1861. These workers were struggling for an 8-hour working day. Occupancy right. This means that the peasants cannot be evicted as a occupancy on land tilled by them is acknowledged. But they are not the owners of the land. Right wing means a group of leaders within the Congress who are opposed to socialism. Strike. The refusal by the workers to work in order to attain certain demands. The Royal Commission on Labour. The commission set up by the British to inquire about the condition of the Indian labourers. Trade unionism. The system practices an ideology of trade unions. The end. Part 3 over. Thank you.